Okay, so good morning. The next section will be chaired by Professor Neeldhara Mishra. She's an assistant professor at Department of Computer Science at IIT Gandhinagar, and her research interests are in theoretical computer science, algorithm design, and game theory. So I would request Professor Neeldhara Mishra to take over.
All right, thank you so much, and very good morning again to everyone. So we're going to start the first part of the computing education research in India session at Compute. And in the first, so there are going to be two talks in this session. I think we have started a little bit over time, and we'll see how this goes. But yeah, there are going to be two talks in this session, and the first of them will be given by R. Venkatesh, who is from TCS Research at Pune, and he will be talking about verifying programming assignments involving arrays. Definitely have a vested interest in listening to this. Very curious. So I'm going to hand this over. To you. Looking forward.
Yeah, thank you, Neeldhara. I hope everyone can hear me. Just sharing my slides.
Yeah, we can hear you and see you just fine. I think your screen is also up now, actually.
Yeah.
Or at least we see that you have started the screen share. And yeah, this is perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about verifying programming assignments involving arrays. This is primarily work that we had done as part of verification research. In this talk, I'm going to present some technical details of that, and also try to link it with how it can be used to programming assignments. So a rough summary is program verification advances that are there, especially when it comes to verifying programs with arrays. Essentially, verification is when you're given a program and a property to check whether that property holds for that program or not. Since this is compute, I'm going to try and link it to how it can be used to correct programming assignments. And at the end, have some thoughts on how we can take this forward in the correcting programming assignments part of the application. So what we did was we took 4 actual assignments. Professor Biraj was kind enough to share with us. For each of those assignments, we had a correct solution written by a teacher. And we also had student assignments, student submissions for those assignments. We had several student submissions. We didn't really go through all of them. We just picked one student submission for each assignment randomly with no particular bias there, just purely randomly. And then we generated tests for coverage. So there are tools that are available that can generate tests for coverage. So given a teacher assignment, it can generate tests for coverage of the teacher assignment. And these coverages are coverages like statement coverage or branch coverage. And we did for branch coverage. And then we ran these tests on the assignments and checked whether the student assignment gave the same result as the teacher's assignment. Yeah. And we were surprised that in one of the 4 assignments tried. So remember, we picked just 4 sample assignments. So there was a bug that was not detected by these tests. So essentially, a typical programming assignment today is corrected by the teacher writing some tests to check whether the assignment is correct or not. And it's not always possible to write good enough tests to find all bugs in an assignment. That's the primary point I want to make with this slide. So it is important to also check whether the assignment is correct or not with respect to some notion of correctness. And in this case, the notion of correctness is that for all inputs, the student's version of the program produces the same output as the teacher's version of the program. That's the application we are really looking at, programming assignment correction. So we'll keep this application in mind while we go through the verification. So just to give a idea of the complexity of the assignment itself, because it may appear that these are trivial assignments and they can be really verified. The assignments were not trivial. There were 4 assignments that we considered. One is you're given n devices and a list of task loads, and you have to make a round robin assignment of those tasks to devices. So you just go through one after the other and assign tasks to devices. So basically you have an array of devices, you have an input array of task loads, and you have to go through the task array and assign it to in a round robin. In the greedy version, you are again given n devices and the same and an input of task load, and you have to make a greedy assignment. Basically, the device that is least loaded should get the next task assigned to it. So there is a computation of minimum here and an assignment of the task. And the assignment also included calculation of spread, in the sense what is the maximum load minus the minimum loaded device. Then the third assignment was array manipulation. So you were given a sequence of operations, insert, delete, and find operations as in an array, and you have to perform those operations on another array. That was the array manipulation assignment. And finally, there was a currency conversion assignment where you're given an array of currency exchange rates. So you're given a bunch of currencies and you're given exchange rates between them. And the assignment was to find all profitable trades. What is a profitable trade? A profitable trade is that you have money in one currency, you convert it to another currency and convert it back to this original currency, and you should end up with a profit. That's what is defined as a profitable trade. And here we are considering only 2 currency trades. The actual assignment also involved 3 currency trades. So you should be able to go from currency 1 to currency 2 to currency 3 and back to currency 1 and end up with a profit. So the assignment was to list all profitable trades. So these were the assignments that that were really given. Okay. Now, going back to the verification problem. So keep this in mind, because this was not the aim of the research that we had done. This was an independent application of whatever we have done. So one simple way of correcting these is to run what is known as a bounded model checker, BMC. What is a bounded model checker? It takes a program, C or C++ program. It could be any. There are bounded model checkers for Java. I don't know if there is for Python at all, but there is definitely for Java. And it checks the program. It takes a program and a property and checks the program for correctness within a finite space, finite state space. Okay, that's where the term bounded comes. And typically what they do is, given any loop, they unroll the loop. For now, let's assume all bounded model checkers, what they do is, given any loop, they unroll those loops for a finite number of bound, which is taken as an input. So let's say you unroll all loops for 3, a bound of 3. And then it unrolls all loops only for 3 iterations, runs all loops only for 3 iterations, and checks whether the program is violated, the property is violated or not for unrolling of 3. So looking at the assignments, so if you look at any of these, let's say you look at the assignment for array insert, delete and thing, what it will say is you can only perform 3 operations. And you have an array of size 3 for maintaining the inserts and all. That's what this bound will imply. Right? And then you run it now it becomes a finite state problem. And therefore, you can really check, exhaustively analyze for all states and check whether there is a bug or not. So typically, the figure on the right says you take a C or C++ code. CBMC is a bounded model checker that is available for free download. Any of you can download it. What it does, because it's a bounded state space, it can convert it into a SAT formula. and then uses a SAT solver and then tells you whether there is a bug or is it okay. So when it says okay, it means it is okay for an unrolling of 3 or whatever, some unrolling of k for the input for the loops, right? And how can we use this? We can take a teacher's program. You can create a third program which passes the same input to the student's program. Let's assume student's program is written as a function s, which takes an input I and returns a value v1. And teacher's program is written as a function t, which takes an input I and returns a value v2. And you want to check that the value of v2, v1, and v2 are the same for all combinations of input. And since this is bounded, the input is also finite. All loops are finite, so it can theoretically be done. The challenge is, of course, scaling it up, whether it can be practically done in a reasonable time. And for an unwinding of 2 or 3, we can really do it. And we ran this for all the assignments for one student thing, and it came out in less than a minute for all of them. Yeah. And here, for simplicity, I've said return values of v1 and v2, but it can be that S sets some global variables and T sets some global variables, and you already know what the global variables are to compare. So it can be even through global variables. That's not an issue. This is just for simplicity of presentation that I presented it this way. Even with bounded model checking, scalability is still a challenge. And bounded model checking works very well based on an hypothesis of small model hypothesis, which where people believe that if there is a bug in the program, there will be a small run in which the bug will surface. It will show up with a finite number of unrolling of loops, for instance. Or if it's a data structure problem, with a small size of the data structure, that same bug will surface. That's the hypothesis. It's not a theory. And it's based on that hypothesis that bounded model checkers are effectively used. And the bug that we found in this program was using bounded model checking. We just ran it for a finite number and we found the bug. So that's all that was needed to find the bug. Yeah. Now, so the question is, bounded model checkers can find bugs. So if there is a bug in an unrolling of 3, it can really find it and tell you there is a bug and this is a input for which that bug shows up. The question is, it cannot say that the program is correct because you don't know whether the bug will show up in an unrolling of 5 or an unrolling of 10 or whatever. So our primary research in our group has been to see how effectively we can use bounded model checking to prove programs correct. So essentially, can we say that for this particular program, you can have a finite number of unrolling of a loop and still say that it is correct. If there is a bug, it will show up in this finite unrolling. So let's take this example of a minimum in an array, finding the minimum element of given an array. So you're given an array A of size S, and here is a loop that finds the minimum while I less than S, if AI is less than min, min is equal to AI, and I plus plus. So here, as you can see, the number of unrolling of the loop depends on the size S, and S can be fairly large. So the question is there a really small value of S for which you can say if there is a bug in the original program, the bug will show up in this for this small value of S? That's the key question we are trying to answer. And it turns out that for minimum program, that value is 1. So if you take this program and you just unroll it once, if there is a bug in the program, it will show up with an unrolling of 1. And the intuition for that is as follows. If you look at the assert, it says that for all j, s, aj is greater than or equal to min, yeah, which is equivalent to saying that there does not exist a k. So when it gets translated to there does not exist a k such that ak is less than min. So it is looking for one element k which is less than minimum. Yeah. So if you can write your loop such that you find that one element, then you're done. Right? that's the primary thing that we are looking at. So given a loop, how many such Ks are needed to be able to prove a property, right? So on the right, you can see that minimum written without the loop. So what we are doing is we say minimum equal to A0. And then we have two variables, I1 and I, which are being assigned a non-deterministic value. When we say star, it means some non-deterministic value. It can take any value. The assume in the next statement says that now consider only runs where the value of I lies between 0 and S, with 0 being included, S being excluded, right? So assume the value, non-deterministic value, assume only those runs for which if the value of I is greater than or equal to S or less than 0, you say the run is a valid run. If it lies between 0 and S, then you check if the value of AI is less than min. If it is less than min, this is the body of the loop. If AI is less than min, min is equal to AI. And then increment I, because that's what the body of the loop is. You just place the body of the loop. And remember, for this program, we said we need only one iteration of the loop, and therefore we have put just the body. And then you have an assert that the original value of I1, which is the I that it is taken, is greater than or equal to min. Okay? So you need only one iteration of the loop, and we can prove that for this particular program, you need only one iteration to prove that it is right. And once you have converted it to one iteration, now you can give this minimum minus loop to a bounded model checker to check whether this assertion really holds or not. Right? So that's the key contribution that we have made, that we have found criteria which can be used to say whether loops can be limited to a finite bound and yet be used to prove that the original program is correct. So essentially, the program on the right is an abstraction of the program on the left. Essentially, what it means is the program on the right allows for more runs than the original program does with respect to the property. That is, so the actual transformation needs to take into account what is the property being tested for. Yeah. So what we have is an input with the loop L, a maximum size M to which you want to check whether it is what we call this a loop shrinking text, a maximum size M to which you want to check whether it is shrinkable up to some value K less than or equal to M, and a property P. Then we check if the loop L is shrinkable, and the way we do that is we try for all values from 1 to n and see if the loop L is K shrinkable. And interestingly, we use a bounded model checker itself to figure out whether a loop L is K shrinkable. And we do that by checking for a property that if a property is violated in K plus 1 iteration, it will also be violated in K iterations. And if it's not violated in K plus 1 iteration, it won't be violated in K iteration for all input values. This is essentially what we check for. So we unroll the loop for K plus 1 and K and give it to a bounded model checker and check whether the two are equivalent with respect to the violation of property. So remember, now it's not equivalent with respect to the computed values, but with respect to violation of the property. And we either say it is K shrinkable, or we say return that it is not shrinkable at all. If it is not shrinkable, we say we can't prove this program. If it is shrinkable, we convert the original loop to a loop L prime with just K iterations and run a BMC, a bounded model checker, on the loop L prime for a property P. So for lack of time, I'm not going to go into more details of this, but details can be found in this particular papers. For those who are interested, they can look at this paper to look at more details on how this proof actually plays out, why it really is true that K is enough to prove the property right. Why is this loop an abstraction of the original loop? So this was finding. What we have done here is we have said we have picked an arbitrary element A of A and checked it with respect to min, and we have said that there does not exist any element of A. If you run this loop for any arbitrary element of A, it won't violate the property. That's what we have shown here. So we have picked Given an array of size n, s, we try, since it's a non-deterministic value, a bounded model checker will try for every element of A and say that there exists no element of A for which, if you execute this particular, if you execute the loop body, will this assert get violated? So there does not exist any element of A. So this is a key property to remember. There does not exist any element of A. So there does not exist k less than s such that ak less than min. There does not exist any element of A for which if you execute this loop body, the assert will get violated. That's what we are really looking for here. And there are loops for which you would say that there does not exist 3 elements of A for which the assert does not get violated. So it depends on what is k in the k shrinkability. It will be 1, 2, 3, whatever. Different loops have different shrinkability. Right? Then after that, we have gone ahead and tried for what we call as loop pruning. This also transforms a program on arrays to a finite loops on arrays to a small finite loop. But here, instead of looking for any element, we look for the first k elements of the array. And we say that if you run the program for the first k elements of the array, if the program gets violated in the original loop, it will definitely get violated in the modified loop. And for min, again, it turns out that the value is 1. Even you just need to look at the first few elements of the array. The intuition is here. It's based on the assumption that array contents are all arbitrary. So that's an assumption we make. If the array contents are arbitrary, there is nothing to distinguish the first element from the rest. Right? So that's the main point that we make here. So please note that the loop starts with I equal to 1. That's important for this particular loop, because otherwise it will become 2 elements. So if the array contents are arbitrary, there's nothing to distinguish the first element of the array from the rest of the elements, because you're assume you assign non-deterministic values to array A, in which case, if it is going to violate at some 100th element, then you can always initialize the value such that the 100th element value is the value of the second element, and therefore it should get violated there too. So that's the key intuition here. And you can know that, you can realize by now you have realized that if you have reduced it to just the first element, then you can again use a bounded model checker to check it. This, of course, does not apply to all arrays, and there are some conditions that a loop must satisfy. One is the array should have non-deterministic content. So it could have any contents. And all our programs have non-deterministic contents for arrays, because the array inputs are given is an input, so it can have any non-deterministic content. Yeah. Indexing inside the loop has to be through a constant or a fixed offset. So you can have, if I is a loop variable, you can have a of I or a of I plus a constant, a of I plus 5, a of I plus 3, whatever, or I minus 1. Outside the loop, all indexing should be constant. So you cannot have a of k for some variable k there. You can have a of 5 or a of 7. Loops are for fixed type, I equal to init, I less than bound, I plus equal to step. Inside the loop, if there is a variable that is modified and used inside the loop, it should be of this format. If V relational operator E, then V is equal to E in the body. Then we have a formula to compute the bound for the array, delta plus 1 into, where delta is the max offset minus min offset, which is the offset of fixed indexing offset. How many array indices are really accessed within a loop body? And if there are multiple loop bodies, the maximum offset that is indexed minus the minimum offset that is indexed. So if you have I plus 1 and I minus 1, then it's 3 delta. VA is the number of variable assignments in loops plus references in arrays. And the formula you get is delta plus 1 into hash VA plus 1. And this is what we use to derive for various. The immediate question, of course, is, okay, are these constraints too restrictive? Do they apply on real programs? So we checked it out on, there is a competition that's held annually called SVCOM, Software Verification Competition. It's held along with conference TACAS. And we checked out this on programs that are there as part of the SVCOMP, and SVCOMP has a category called array programs. So we considered only array programs within the SVCOMP category. The total number of programs we considered were 167. That is all the programs that were amenable to our analysis. Of which 123 we did not have any bug, 44 were buggy programs. So correct here means correct programs with respect to the property, and incorrect means incorrect with respect to the property. 81 of them, of the 123, were shrinkable. That means you could analyze for any arbitrary k elements, and the shrinking was 1, 2, or 3. They were very small number of elements. And 26 of the incorrect programs. So more than half of the programs, as you can see, were shrinkable. A much smaller percentage were prunable. So 38 of the correct ones and 10 of the wrong ones. That's because for pruning, we still have some very tight constraints on the program. 65 of the 81 were only shrinkable, which means that they were not prunable. 17 of the incorrect ones. 22 of the correct ones were prunable, but not shrinkable. And only one of the incorrect one was only prunable, but not shrinkable. And 16 were both and. So there was a reasonable number of programs in an arbitrary benchmark that were amenable to shrinking and pruning. Yeah. And we implemented this, we have implemented this technique in a tool, Variabs, which came first in the array reach subcategory of SVCOMP in 2081, primarily because of array shrinking and pruning. Because Variabs, what it does is it just converts programs to a bounded loops, and then uses a bounded model checker to check for correctness or find bugs. Yeah. Now coming to the assignments. If you look at the round robin allocation, this is how a teacher's program would look. And then we followed by a student's program, and we assume there are two arrays, load and load prime, which are modified by the teacher's program and the student's program. And we check whether the values in load and load prime are the same. That's the property we check for, to check for correctness, right? And this one is amenable to shrinking. It satisfies the conditions for shrinking. In fact, all of the 4 assignments are amenable to shrinking or pruning. That's what we found. And this is how the program that is, it is amenable to, it is too shrinkable. That is, we need to look for 2 elements of the array to check if it's correct or not. And then this is how the shrunk program, if you like it, would look like. So we just have 2 iterations of the loop, but in both the iterations, we pick some arbitrary element of the array to increase, and we check for that arbitrary element. We are not really looking for the first element or the second element. We look for some arbitrary 2 elements of the array and check whether those 2 arbitrary elements, the program values are equivalent for those arbitrary elements. Yeah. So this particular program is definitely shrinkable. The greedy assignment is prunable. Yeah. So again, what we do, we take the greedy allocation of the teacher followed by allocation. I've not written the code for the student, but this loop is followed by the allocations code for the student. And then we check for whether the loads are equivalent or not. And remember here, we need to find the minimum load device. Yeah, that itself is a function. It's an arbitrary function which returns a minimum load device, which is fairly complex. And similarly, we have, after pruning, this is again two prunable. So we need to run 2 iterations of the array. So we have a counter which executes only for the first 2 iterations of the array. Here, it is the first 2 iterations of the array, not some arbitrary indices into the array. And then we have again prune the teachers program, prune the students program, and compare for the pruned. And we can prove that if this pruned program is correct, that is CBMC or some bounded model checker does not find a bug in the pruned program, there does not exist a bug in the original program. That is something we can prove, and therefore you can use pruning to check whether the student's program is correct or wrong. Yeah. There are several other, these are just two techniques. There are additional other techniques that we are really working on for array programs. One is, couple of them are, Divyesh is working with Supratik from IIT Bombay on tiling and full program induction. We also use, try to guess invariance, quantified invariance explicitly. So given array programs, we have templates of invariance and we try to guess those invariants using navigating through a syntax space, syntax guided synthesis. So we use syntax guided synthesis to guess invariance. And we are also looking at an alternative approach, which is targeted at this assignment correction. What we mean by assignment correction is we have given two functions which we know are computing the same algorithm or same values, same functions. We are given two programs that compute the same function, and we want to check whether they are equivalent. Equivalent with respect to some given set of variables. So we are using hypercity verification techniques to try and check that. So this actually assumes that two are doing the same thing and interleaves them to see whether they are behaving similarly all the time. Yeah. So it's a very different technique designed for assignment correction in some sense. It was originally proposed for concurrent execution, and we are applying it for assignment correction. This is the work that we are doing. So some final thoughts for automating correction. I think BMCs, bounded model checkers like CBMC with the small unbinding can be used, and they are fairly good at detecting bugs. If you believe in the small model hypothesis, they're fairly effective. We can try and use verification wherever possible. Verification does not always scale up, but whichever programs it is possible for, verification is a good technique to use to find bugs in programs. Giving marks is always an issue. So we will need tests to determine, because we don't want to give 0 or 1 for programs. We give marks based on the number of tests passed. And if the BMC's result says it is correct, we should give some extra marks. The verification results is correct, we should give some extra marks for programs where the verification and BMC results are correct. So that's one way of using verification in correction. Further directions, we are open to working with anyone interested in expanding the range of programs that can be verified using shrinking. Pruning in particular, we believe holds a lot of promise. And there is an equivalent theorem in logic, a finite model theorem. And I think something equivalent, something that can be applied here. Maybe institutes can collaborate to build a verification tool that can be used. And it may work, it may not work, but at least some programs where it works, we can do it. And we can maybe have some way by which it's a cloud hosted tool that can be used by all institutions. That's a possible path forward. Presentation has the references that have been recited, and you're free to contact any of us for queries or collaborations. Thank you. I'm open to taking questions.
All right, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. And I think we already have a few questions in the chat. Let me just, actually they're in a pretty natural order. So the first question was from Amay, and he was asking if the pruning and shrinking processes that you described are automated or are they manual?
Yeah, the pruning and shrinking are both completely automated. And that's how we have put it in the VeriApps tool for the competition. And it actually checks whether the program is prunable or shrinkable. And only if it is, it applies that technique. It's totally automated.
I see, right. So in fact, that answers my question as well, because I also wanted to know if checking if a program is prunable or shrinkable is also automated. And it seems like that is so true. And further, the way that your program checks if a program is prunable is based on those conditions that you described, right?
Right.
And so those conditions are so if a program meets those conditions, then it's guaranteed to be prunable
Yes.
or respectively. But is it possible that there are programs beyond that that may happen to be prunable, shrinkable, but not captured by these conditions? In other
Absolutely.
words,
We strongly believe that these conditions are too tight.
I,
There are programs which can are prunable, but these conditions don't capture them adequately. There is a
I
need to expand these conditions more, relax these conditions a bit more to get.
right.
So, for example, right now, for pruning, what we do is we say a program is prunable if in the original program there is a property is violated for some values of the array in some indices. Since arrays can take non-deterministic values, the programs are such that those same values, the first few elements can take the same values. You can assign non-deterministic values initially such that you have those same values coming at the first few indices of the array. If it's k prunable in the first k indices of the array. That is the property that we use to check whether it is prunable or not. So essentially, if it violates in the 100th and 101st element of the array, then we can say that we can give initial values to the array such that the first and second element have the same values.
Right.
Yeah. That's the property we check for. This is a very tight check. This is not using the actual property being verified.
Mm-hmm. So more
We are
generic.
saying the values are be exactly the same, and that's we feel is too strong a check.
Right.
We can relax that tech check to allow for a much wider set of programs to be prunable.
Right. Perhaps by potentially exploiting structures of the property itself, as you were mentioning.
Yes. Exploiting the
Right.
structures of the property itself.
Right. Makes sense. And I think Viraj also had a couple of questions which are related, so I'll kind of bundle them. The first one was, how easy is it for faculty to use these tools, maybe in a real world classroom setting where you're teaching intro to programming or algorithms or whatever, in perhaps in that context, I assume. And also the follow-up question was, is there opportunity for synergy between faculty giving programming assignments and the kind of research that you're doing? And if so, how? And I think you partially addressed this in your concluding slide about future directions, but I'll let you speak to this a
Right.
little more.
So how easy it is for the faculty? That's a good question. So as I said, the tool that we have developed has been primarily for a program and a given property to check for that. It hasn't really been designed for assignment. So some amount of engineering will be needed to take it to an assignment form. And we may have to put some constraints on the assignment writing itself in the sense of what variable names will be used or some for the output values. Not the local variables can be anything, but the output values. And that's not a severe constraint on the assignment. For example, in the loading function, you can say the array should be named load and the input array will be named this or whatever. But there would have to be some engineering that is done to transform an assignment program into a program that is amenable to this property. That work needs to be done. That we have not done as yet. And as I had said in the concluding slide, we are open to working with collaborators to see how this can be taken up for making it an assignment checking program.
Right. So potentially the cloud-based tool that you were envisioning will address this to some extent.
Yes. That will automatically transform, it will just take two programs, a student program and a teacher program, perform all the transformations required and say.
Right. And so this is probably like a very naive question, but I think the teachers currently automate their grading is by just working with a large sometimes automated, sometimes manually curated set of tests, right?
Right.
So I just wanted to sanity check if my understanding is right. With that approach, the advantage is perhaps that you can generate these tests and maybe manually check for certain expected border edge cases and things like that. But it's never going to be formally comprehensive. But it's something that probably is usable right now and it scales in a certain sense. Whereas the advantage with your approach is that it's more or less guaranteed that if the student's program is problematic, then it will definitely be identified. Would that
Absolutely.
be a fair comparison?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a fair thing. But there is one more advantage of using tests, which I mentioned, is that you can give different, if it's a 10-mark question, you can say if it passed 3 tests, he gets 8 marks. If it fails this one test, you subtract 1 mark. If it fails that test, you subtract 4 marks, whatever. You have a variable grading. This one gives a 0-1 answer. So you cannot do away with the tests. You can possibly generate those tests automatically and decide.
Right. In fact, potentially your tool could also be extended to do that, right? I mean,
yeah, there are tools already available to generate tests. CBMC itself does generate test generation.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. All right, excellent. I'm just going to sanity check if there are any more questions in the chat. I think not. I'm just scrolling back a little bit, but okay. So I think I don't see any further questions, and I'll just reiterate the call to potentially collaborate. This would be very exciting if it can actually, if the last mile goes through, and to see something like this in the classrooms would be absolutely amazing. So, and this was, thank you once again for a great talk.
Thank you very much, Neeldhara, and thanks all the participants for your patience.
All right, so virtual applause. Thank you so much again. And,
thank you.
We're perhaps now ready to move to the second talk in this session, which is going to be about Tutor. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is a system for automated tutoring of introductory programming courses. And if I remember right, maybe with a special focus on Python, but maybe we'll find out more. The talk is going to be by Amay Karkare, who is a Associate Professor at IIT Kanpur, and I'm going to request you to sort of take it away from here. Thank you. Okay, just quickly confirming that we can see your screen, but I'm not.
Okay, so can you hear me now? So I just unmuted also. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, so this talk is about Pruter, but I'm not going to describe the architecture or the Pruter system itself, but it will be more about how it can help quite in line with what Venkatesh already did. Okay, so the reason we are looking at these automated tools and they are becoming more and more necessary in today's world. And we all know why this is so. I mean, I'll quickly go through first few slides. It's because online education is growing at a very high speed. Okay, so Khan Academy kind of started it, but then MOOCs also came up. And last few years has seen that the enabling technologies have made it really possible for online education to reach masses. Okay. And even mobiles with hardwares also have been helpful because now almost everybody carries a smartphone. And finally, last 7 or 8 months or so, this new normal COVID-19 has caused traditional classrooms to shift to your mobile devices. So all this is fine, doing classes is fine, listening to lectures is fine. But the major challenge in online classes is that lack of personalized feedback, which is so common when you have labs, physical labs, people coming in and sitting there, and TAs, tutors, teachers are standing really behind you and telling you if you are making mistakes. So this is a thing which is missing in online classes. And we are focusing on introductory programming and how we can bridge this gap. Okay, so talking about introductory programming, there are some challenges which are specific to programming. So one is how to provide early feedback. I mean, I have taught these introductory programming, and almost all engineering institutes have it. So most of you will be having this experience, that students who get some compile time error or some other error and are not able to fix it within a reasonable time start getting frustrated, and those are the ones who lose interest in programming. So those students who get results are always happy, and they kind of pick up very quickly. But on the other hand, the challenge is even in physical classrooms is we do not have too much resources. Probably IITs are sitting at a good number of TAs, but there are colleges which may not have masters or PhD programs, and then they lack human resources. So they have limited TA support. And even at a place like IIT, the TAs have varying expertise. So they do grading according to their knowledge, according to their bias. And this creates a problem that for same kind of error, different students get different marks. And then there is this regrading and other challenges. Nobody likes to work extra hours. I mean, grading these assignments takes a long time, or even giving feedback. And everyone wants that if 1 mark is deducted for my friend for some error, then my 1 mark should also be deducted for same error. I don't want extra marks to be deducted and so on. Okay, so before we started developing Pruter, we tried to look for existing solution. And one of the solution which we could look at was browser-based IDE called IDE1. It's a very nice IDE if you want to just try some new language and you are not, you do not have resources, or you do not want to install just a compiler or something before you finalize some language. You can just go to ide1.com, and it will give you online compiler for probably 40-50 languages or more. Okay, some quite obscure as well, because it's a good place to just do some sanity testing of small programs. But the problem is this is quite limited in its capability. It does not support any debugger. There are no evaluations in the sense the teacher, if they want to provide some test cases and all, students cannot use them. They have to copy and paste and so on. And finally, it does not give any feedback to the student per se beyond compiler error. Okay, if a program is wrong, output is wrong, they have to go back and check with the expected output from teacher and all. There are these judge programs which are used by many of these coding platforms like SPOJ, CodeChef, and others. They are typically editorless, which means you type on one system, then you copy your program, submit it, and then you get back the results. Okay. So problem with these is something what Venkatesh also said, that grading partial submissions is difficult. I mean, these are judge programs. They just say your program is right or wrong. So it's a binary classification. And then it also does not give you if it passed some tests or not. Okay, the number of tests. So this is good for competitive programmers who know programming language and trying to either get more expertise or trying to compete with others. These judge programs are not so good for beginners. Recently, I mean, these programs are also investing into converting them into which can be used by beginners for teaching and all. But I'm talking about a couple of years back, scenario 2-3 years back. Yeah. So this became the motivation to come up with our own system called Pruter. And Pruter, actually it's a short form for programming tutor. So, and we published our initial paper on arXiv in 2016, but the work is going on since around 2014. So it has been 6 years since Pruter has been used at IIT Kanpur for teaching introductory programming courses. In between, it has been used at multiple other places. IIT Bombay used it for a few years. ISC is using, Professor Viraj has been using it. So thanks to these people, it is becoming popular, as well as we are getting feedback about improving the system. Okay, so those who are interested in knowing about Pruter and few videos about how it works, they can go to this website. So it's on my webpage as well. And you will see some videos about internals of Pruter, because That is something I'm not going to cover in this course, except very quick, some quick details. So here is the interface of Pruter, which a student sees when he logs in. Okay, and just one correction, because Neil Dhara said that this is not restricted to Python. Pruter can support any language as long as it can have a compiler on Linux-like system. So C, C++, Python, Java, we have tried Haskell, MATLAB, Octave. So all these languages can be supported, because at the back end, we are running a Linux server which compiles, runs the programs and sends back the results. So it's that way language agnostic. So again, in this interface, you see there is some editor window on the right. So let me just use. Yeah, so there is an editor window where students can type their code. They can see the problem statement. And depending on what they are doing, they can either execute the program using their own set of inputs, or they can use evaluation to execute their program on instructor provided inputs. And it will show them how it ran, what test cases passed, what failed, and so on. And it also allows some held back test cases. Means again, instructor does not want to expose all their test cases. So some use cases or the users of the Pruter system, of course, students are the major users. They write programs and evaluate them. But from instructor side, it also works as an assignment management system. So instructor can assign or add problems to Pruter, and then they can manage events like labs or exams or some quizzes kind of thing. So tutor's role is added. Again, this is specific to IIT Kanpur, the kind of roles we have, but we could easily change them. So for example, at IIT Bombay, they do not have a concept of tutor. So we could easily convert them to TAs and all. So they can manage event, so tutors can add problems, modify them. TAs are typically only for grading and providing manual feedback. But the main people who benefit from Pruter is developers who can write feedback tools. So, I mean, with some, probably collaborating with Venkatesh, we can make sure that his array checking tool can become part of Pruter. So such things are possible. And similarly, researchers. So just like Venkatesh said that Viraj provided certain programs and then he could work on them. So similarly here, researchers can get this data to analyze student activity. And in fact, we have huge amount of data, and some of that I will present in the rest of the talk. So quick architecture overview of Pruter. So Pruter is built using the concept of containers. So we use Docker. So basically, the system does not run directly on hardware. It runs on a virtualization layer. And on top of it, we have something called a manager, which looks at these different services. So each of these services in itself is a container. Okay. So basically, there is a proxy so that it can do load balance among incoming requests and other requests. Database for handling all the load, basically programs which are there. So all the data about the students. Then cache to speed up things, and web application is actual application, the user interface, and engine in the Linux is the Linux server, which runs the programs and generates results. So this is an overview of how these 6 components are connected together. Okay, so these arrows do not mean any direction. They are just saying that, for example, web application service uses the services of in-memory cache to get data. Okay. The interesting part about creating an architecture which is modular is that we can easily scale it. So depending on the number of students, we can scale specifically the web application part and the engine services part. So there is a lot of UI activities, web application needs to be replicated. And if there is a lot of compute activities, we can replicate engines. Other components can either remain the same, or if you want, you can even replicate them depending. So till now, on a kind of slightly advanced desktop kind of machine, we can easily support 500 students. And with the little bit advanced machines, we could see by creating clusters, we could, that we have not tested on real deployment, but just using some simulators, we could scale up to 5,000 or so students in connections. Okay, So yeah, this is just the part about introduction of Pruter. What I am more interested in is describing our experiments, because this is what is in some sense will help us coming up with a system where online teaching can also use personalized feedback, or can give personalized feedback to students. So in these experiments, our focus is on compilation error repair. And the first work which we did was published in XCSEED, and I've listed some of the collaborators on that work. And most of this work is done by my PhD student Umair Ahmed as part of his PhD. So he's recently completed and now moved out of IIT Kanpur. Why compilation error are important? So everyone thinks that compiler gives such a good job, does such a good job of giving an error message whenever there are some compiler errors. So let's look at simple examples. And again, remember that my motivation is students, especially introductory programming students. Okay, so this is the error which is quite common when you are teaching introductory programming and students have just come from class 12th, completed their class 12th, and they have a lot of mathematical knowledge, because probably for few years they have been doing coaching for maths and solving lots of math problems. So when you ask them to multiply two expressions, this is quite common. They will say a plus b times a minus b, because that's how we write it in mathematics. And when they try to compile and run the program, this is an error message. I have shrinked it a little bit, but this is the essence of the error message that a compiler gives. It says called object type int is not a function. Okay, we are talking about third or fourth lecture in the programming course. Types have probably been touched upon, but maybe functions have not yet been covered, and objects and other things that is not being covered. So this is quite a confusing message for a student. Okay, for an introductory student, where is the object, what is int, what is all going on? Okay, instead what we really want to convey the message somehow that the student has missed this multiplication sign or maybe plus sign, we don't know. Okay, but that's probably this is the corrected program after students struggled for some time and then figure out what is the error. Another error is about type errors, and in this case, those who work on CE programming fairly regularly, even they make this mistake, missing out on the ampersand in scanf. And again, the rules are little confusing for the starters, but let's say what error message we get if we try to run this program. In this case, it's a warning message generally, but yeah, for our purpose, it's an error because it will produce finally produce an wrong result. Okay, it says format specifies type int star, but the argument has type int. And now the student has painstakingly learned that star stands for multiplication, probably started using it. Suddenly he sees a star appearing in an error message, which is not at all about multiplication. So this also becomes quite confusing. So error messages are confusing. What we really want to hint at is that you should use this ampersand operator, and explaining that in simple terms would be much more beneficial than this error message, which is correct. However, it is targeted towards experienced programmer. Okay, it assumes that the user of this error message or consumer of this error message has understanding of pointers, has understanding of other advanced concepts. So one choice could be, yes, make these error messages more informative, rewrite them and so on, which is being done. I mean, CLang produces much better error messages than GCC if you have some experience, but then this is a significant effort. And then you have to replicate it for all programming languages. You have to replicate it for all new kind of languages that are coming and so on. Okay. And this whole thing becomes confusing and time consuming for beginners. A simple missing ampersand or missing star, they take a lot of time, and then they start losing interest in the programming because they think this is illogical. Okay. And in many cases, it requires a human supervision to bring them back on track. I mean, I have seen a case where a student had missed an ampersand and he was just hitting compile button again and again in the hope that program will get corrected automatically. Okay. What we desire is a system like this, So I am again showing the Pruter interface, but this is an experimental interface, not released. So in which we would like to give hints like this. So line 5, the error what I showed earlier, student has typed this code. When he compiles the code, he or she should get a message like this, that this is what you should do to fix your line. Okay. Similarly, in line 7, student is putting semicolon by mistake, comma by mistake instead of semicolon. So the hint repair should be like this, that it is telling what error has been made. Now, one question comes out pedagogy, should we immediately display this error or not? Should we hold it back for some time? So those are important questions from pedagogical perspective. How many times or how much time should we wait before we show this final answer to them? But my answer is that as a researcher, my goal is to create the system which can produce the repair as a programming language researcher. Okay, yes, parallel research is required to figure out how useful these are, when should we produce them, how will they affect learning behavior and so on. They are very, very important question, but unfortunately, I am not capable to answer them. So later I will show you some user study where we collaborated with some people who are in pedagogy domain, and they helped us conduct some user studies to consider effectiveness of these repairs. Okay, and so on. So our solution is called Tracer, and how does it work? So once again, we are using something from other domains of computer science, especially machine learning, which is quite common in these days. And just to send a disclaimer that we are a consumer of machine learning. I'm not going to improve the system there. We are using off-the-shelf machine learning systems, the neural networks, RNNs, and others. Okay. So in this case, we are using an RNN. So what is RNN? So it's a very useful solution or very popular solution for typical language translation. So the example here from Stanford shows that the language German is being translated into English language. Okay, so what we used is RNN with long short-term memory extension. Unfortunately, due to limited time, I'm asking you to go through the paper which is there on my webpage as well as online available to see the models and parameters described, or you can look at Umair's thesis, all available through my webpage. Okay, so the idea is typically RNN is used from translation from language X to language Y. For us, language X is the language of errors, the programs which produce compile time errors. Language Y is corresponding program which does not have a compile time error or which has been fixed. Okay, so how do we go about that? So basically, we need to train this neural network. So we use 20,000 plus pairs of erroneous program and corresponding repaired program. So thanks to Pruter, we actually store the evolution of program that students are typing. So every few seconds, a snapshot of program gets saved in our database. So we can look at the history of program, how it is evolving. So as a post-mortem step, we collected data from one semester, about 400 plus student submissions. And then we looked at the history of these submissions to see compile errors that were reported. And we tried to find out the nearest program where this compile time error was fixed. Okay. Using these two programs, we extracted pairs of erroneous and repaired programs. Here is an example. So this is an erroneous program. Again, I put just UKN here, but it could be any code which is not correct. And corresponding repair, after some time, student has fixed it by putting A star B. So both these programs are by the same student. Okay. So we have this in our repository. We just have to search them. But even after searching, the rest of the program is not very useful because it's going to be useless and the data will increase. So training, it can bias the training. So we want to extract only the part which is going to affect our neural network, the erroneous line and corresponding repaired line. Okay, so I'm not going to describe the challenges here, but you can think of a student will try several things. So this program gets mutated quite often before the final repaired program is reached. So getting these corresponding lines is not so easy as it is shown here. Okay, but we could do it for a substantial amount of programs. But then if I train my neural network using C equal to A times B, then also it's not a good thing. Okay, because it is going to get biased, or it is going to learn these variable names and constants also, which is not the correct thing, because these names change or these constructs change across the program. So learning, we want it to be useful across programs. So we abstract the program components. Okay, so here is some idea. For example, variable names are not very useful for us, but on the other hand, data types are useful, because type errors can be can cause issues. Okay, and we want to learn those type errors also. The literal themselves are not important, but the fact that they are constants plus their types is important. Finally, there are certain keywords which are important. So for example, we do not want to drop this int, or similarly inside strings also there are some kind of format strings, especially %s, %d, which are important, which can cause a program to behave correctly or incorrectly. So those things we retain as it is. Other things we map to corresponding abstract components. Okay, so in other words, the buggy code line which we extracted as C equal to A space unknown, it gets abstracted out as int is equal to int times unknown. And now this line is going to be used for learning. Okay, and now we feed it to our RNN, which has been trained using several such lines. So on one side we have int equal to int space unknown. On other side, or the repaired pair will have proper operator in between and proper integer or expression on the right hand side. So we use these pairs to train abstract program pairs, and then we use sec networks to suggest the top or predicted abstractions. So this is our source language now, and these are the target languages to which it can translate to. And depending on the number of occurrences, this ordering may be different, but finally, these are the three repairs that our system has suggested. And you can see that all three seem to be viable fixes. Okay. It just so happened that in the data set that we used, multiplication was used more often. That's why it was recommended as top abstraction. Okay. Now the next challenge is we cannot just give this program as it is to the student. Okay, so this we have predicted, but we cannot tell a student that your program can be fixed by replacing int unknown by int star int. We really want to show them the program in their or minimum changes to their program. So we have to concretize these abstract program tokens. And the idea here is we try to align the three things. The first one is your original buggy line. The second thing is your abstract buggy line. Now these three are going to be aligned quite easily, because abstract line is derived from concrete line. So you know how they align. But the predicted line may have different number of tokens than the abstract line. In this case itself, some parentheses are missing, a star has been introduced, and so on. Okay, so we have to figure out how to align them. So we use an off-the-shelf aligner, which works on the similar principle as used in edit distance or Levenshtein distance. So it tries to minimize the cost of converting abstract token sequence into predicted token sequence. And you can see it has been aligned now. Okay. Now, once the tokens have been aligned in abstract error, basically erroneous program and predicted program, we have to now convert predicted program into concrete sequence. So to do this, we try to reuse tokens from the concrete program that a student has submitted. In this case, C equal A are coming from the original program. R is something which our prediction has provided. However, you can see that this B we have to conjure from thin air. Okay, so there are few heuristics. We try to either insert a variable which has been used very recently, which has the same type as expected, or if we fail, then we insert certain constants in some order and so on. Okay, but This is all heuristic driven approximate process, but at the same time, our idea is that the student will get some kind of help from this process. Okay, so here are our results. Our abstract solution worked 69% of the time, which means our top prediction abstract matched student fix exactly 69% of the time. And when we converted into concrete solution, then 80% of that were exactly matching the student submission. Okay, the corrected code that we have collected from our database. For multiple line error programs, so programs can have multiple errors, the success ratio comes down. So it came down to 44% for concrete solution success. Again, we are saying our solution matched student solution, okay, which we collected from our database. And the previous state of the art at that time was 27%. So it is actually a significant improvement. And this 27% does not take into account the stringent correctness criteria that the prediction has to be same as student solution. Okay. The total time taken here is few hours for training, offline RNN training. But after that, each repair takes about 2 seconds to be generated. Okay. So this is the case where given an incorrect program which is not compiling, we can generate a program which is compiling. Then we decided to reuse or extend this work. Okay. So the idea behind the second work or similar error fix pair generation was that we learn from others' mistake. The idea of previous work is to give you the fix. Here we are not going to give you fix. We say that a programmer can learn from how some other programmer fixed a similar kind of error. So this is kind of learning by demonstration or learning by watching others. Okay. The major challenge here is identifying similar errors. So we have huge number of submissions, huge number of errors. How do we identify that certain error is similar to other? But recall that we already have this error and fix pair, and we also have the abstraction corresponding to these errors. So this abstraction helps here as well. But then once we have decided which abstraction is going to be, which abstractions are similar, we also have to decide which concrete example to present to the student. Okay. Now, different concrete example will give you same abstraction. So we have to decide on the some example which is not exactly identical, but which is also not very different from student error. So for this, we used the dense neural network. Again, in this case also models and parameters are described. I'm not going to go into ML part here. Idea here was now from our data set, we looked at errors plus repairs as one single thing. Okay, as a class, each class will have 3 tuples, some error ID. These error IDs are internal numbers which uniquely identify an error or set of errors. Okay, tokens added. Basically, if you are fixing an error, what new tokens have you added and what new token or what old tokens have you deleted? So let me explain it with an example. So here is an erroneous program and corresponding repaired program. Okay, assuming some error ID 1 for this error, compile time error, it will replace this operator is unknown or something, syntax error. Okay, so let's say that error is 1. So we say that from this error ID, we are removing this bang symbol. Okay, and then we are adding bang equal to symbol. Okay, so note that we don't have to again remember the whole bang bracket open equal to because some kind of cleanup is done to shorten the amount of data we have to store. Okay, we only want to store unique things. Okay, so here are a few more examples. So basically, the previous example where we were having multiplying 2 numbers without a star, it says the class is E15 corresponding to the error, and sorry, error ID is E15 and you have to add a star. Okay, this is the same error I showed. Similarly, some student made a mistake where instead of round braces, he put square brackets. So this is another class 210, which has an error number is 62, and then you have to add 2 parentheses and you have to remove. square parentheses and so on, square brackets and so on. Okay, so now the search to find similar program is nothing but a database lookup. We have to find all our data set to figure out an error which had the same class, and we also have corresponding exam or repair with us. Okay, so within that we have to do some kind of prioritizing, but then we can generate the example after prioritizing. Okay, so three cases are shown here. Here I'm just showing the example generated, but really this is a better thing. It just has too many things. So what we really show to the student is program before error and program after error. Okay, this color coding is just for the explanation purpose. It is not presented. Unfortunately, the Pruter cannot support this level of detailing, but it is trying to show that a star has been added to fix the error. And you can see that actual target also requires a star to be inserted. Similarly, in second example, comma has to be inserted. Okay, note that in second example, we cannot predict that %d also has to be inserted. The reason being, the program itself is a compilable program. So this will just be a warning in certain versions of C, that missing %d, certain compilers of C. This is not an error by NCC standard. Okay, so we are unable to catch that. There are cases where our system fails. For example, in the last example, student has by mistake put P plus A on the left hand side and P on the right hand side, though he meant P equal to P plus A. Okay, he meant to have this repair. However, our system treats this as a comparison operator. Our system thinks that student has by mistake put an assignment when he meant comparison. So the suggestion is quite wrong in this case. Okay, but as you see the program itself, the suggestion is not irrelevant. It's just that it's not at the correct place. Okay, so for this case, in case of single line error, so we only handle single line errors. Our predictions or our examples were accurate for 87% of the time. Basically, whenever we showed the examples, correct example was shown at number 1 as the top example. Correct example was shown in top 3 in 98% of the cases, and a correct example was shown in top 5 at 99% of the cases. So it is quite useful, provided we can take care of certain incorrect feedback that we are generating. In this case, training phase was quite simple. It just took a few seconds. Okay, and predicting class during testing phase also requires a few milliseconds. So it is quite a lightweight tool. Okay, so now we have these two tools. How do we compare them, whether they are really helping students or not? Okay, so this is the study we did with Professor Nishit, who is one of the experts in pedagogical aspects. So we wanted to check whether explicit repair gives more benefit or similar example generation gives more benefit from learning perspective. Okay, so what we did was we deployed these tools in one of the offerings of introductory programming at IIT Kanpur. So in 2017-18, and it was only deployed for first 7 labs because they are kind of simple labs, as well as our tool cannot handle very complex problems. Okay, so each lab is 3 hours long. A student attempt 3 to 4 programming assignments under the guidance of TAs and on Pruter system. We specifically instructed TAs not to help students beyond certain until certain thresholds. So TAs were guided that they are not supposed to help students for at least 5 minutes. Okay. We modified Pruter interface. Again, in this diagram, I'm showing both the feedback, but we divided our class into 2 about equal size. Half the class was shown tracer output, the repair, and other half was shown similar examples. In case of similar examples, they had a choice of clicking this plus button, in which case they could see more examples. So this is top 1 by default, but a student has clicked plus once for second example and plus 2 for the third, plus twice for the third example. as student clicks plus, we show more and more examples. Okay, so we did some study about the time taken by the students. So for control group, we use data from 2 previous semesters. So as you can see, the number of students is almost same, 450 approximately in each semester. We used 16-17 second semester and 17-18 first semester. In each case, we have about 14,000 erroneous submissions. In the experimental group, we divided the class into two partitions, repair partition and example partition, about half the size. Okay. The reason there is slight mismatch is because we use roll numbers to divide the class into 2 parts, and because of some drops and other things, the number of odd roll numbered student is not same as number of even roll numbered students. Right. So here is the summary of the result. The time taken to fix error in earlier offerings as recorded by Pruter was about 85 seconds in 16-17 second semester and about 103 seconds in 17-18 semester. Okay. In contrast, in our experimental group, it came down to 75 seconds and 78 seconds. And as you can see, standard deviation also came down. But these numbers, once again, have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Because remember, in earlier semesters, a TA has to walk to the student's desk and then try to explain if there is an error, or students are just struggling with their errors to fix them. Okay, so here TAs had helped them. Maybe student has taken help or not, we don't know. That part is not recorded. On the other hand, in this case, TAs were instructed not to help, so students were only given tool help. Okay, and this help was given during labs only. During exams, both the tools were switched off. Okay, so these are average result. But since they are not telling much about the learning, we looked at a very unique kind of thing which is common in other engineering domains, something called survival probability. Okay, what is a survival probability? Survival probability says that suppose an error has been generated by compiler, error has been reported by compiler, how long does it take for the student to fix it? Okay, so what is the probability that this error will remain there after 10 seconds, after 20 seconds, after 30 seconds, after 40 seconds? So this probability we are capturing across events. As you can see, at time 0, error has been just generated, so survival probability is 1, it is there. Okay, as time increase, survival probability of errors decrease, which means after some 50 seconds, only 40% of the errors remain. Okay, after 100 seconds, only 25% of the error remains. Okay, then there are certain errors which go beyond 200 seconds, which are quite complex. Maybe students are unable to solve them without explicit help. So this gives us some idea about, are these tools effective? As you can see, the survival probability itself is not very easy to visualize. So what we did, we looked at average of base semesters, 1781 and 1672, and looked at the difference between survival probability of repair batch and example batch with respect to average of these two. And now you can see that, yes, our tool makes sure that survival probabilities are reduced. Okay, errors are getting fixed faster. Left hand side is about lab event when the tools are on. During exams, we have switched off the tools, but we still have the data, which student got repair feedback, which student got example feedback. So we looked at their performance in the exam, and surprisingly or not so surprisingly, during exam, they could not perform any better than previous semester where students were not getting any tool help. Okay, so in a sense, this is a negative result. Tools are not performing better than human help or self-help. But on the other hand, it is also not a negative, it's also a positive result in the sense that tools are not going to degrade the performance. They are able to replace human TAs. Okay. So tools are providing logistic improvement. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, terribly sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to point out that we are it's just about noon at this point. Although we'd love to continue listening, it would be great if we can make a little bit of time for a couple of questions in the chat. So would it be
sure. So I will just conclude. I think these are the last few slides. So same probability for specific errors. We can skip that. And another, just give me 1 minute, so I will conclude. Okay. So another thing we noticed was for simple errors, tools are more effective, but for complex error, they also take more time. Students still take more time. Okay. So to conclude, designing these intelligent tutoring system required multi-phased methods. I mean, you cannot just dump your data into some intelligent system and expect to get results. So in our case, it required 4 stages. Data played a very important role. And I mean, what I want to give as a take-home message is that having our own system helped us, because it helped us collect data. It helped us conduct these user studies. Okay. So in future, we plan to explore more kind of errors. So this is all about compile time error. We are looking. We should also look at logical errors. Other domains like trigonometry proofs, where also students make mistakes. And finally, we need a lot of user studies to measure the effectiveness, which is also very challenging because our tool is affecting the learning process. So unless we do effective studies, no one is going to believe us. Okay. So thank you very much. Yeah, I would be happy to take questions.
Okay,
yeah, sorry
thank
for the long time. Yeah.
No, not at all. No, this was clearly absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much, and we definitely have like a very engaged audience. Let me just do questions in reverse chronological order. So Dr. Swati has asked, what is the amount of time that is required to train the students to be comfortable with this tool? What's your experience?
With Pruter?
Yeah, that's right. But I'm with Pruter.
Right. See, Pruter interface is very, very simple. It's browser based. Okay. And nowadays, almost everyone has some knowledge about these menu buttons. So, it takes, we generally conduct one lab, which is a practice lab, and they use it for 2 or 3 hours during this lab. So this is, in fact, this is a live assignment, practice assignment, which I have just given for a batch to get familiarized with Pruter.
Right. And I think there was an earlier question about whether Pruter can be used in exams and if student activity is tracked when it's used in an exam. I think you partially addressed that already when you did your studies.
So Pruter can be used for exams in the sense that it has few features which get disabled, with the like help features disabled. Okay, but Pruter as of now cannot be used to conduct fully online exams, like students are sitting at home, and then it can be used to conduct proctored exam. Little bit of proctoring is needed. Okay, because I can always share my login with someone else, and that someone else can write code on my behalf. So those kind of problems are there. Okay, but it has been used to conduct course exams as well as entrance exams. So nowadays, every semester we conduct our MTech and PhD interviews. One part is programming interviews conducted on a programming assignment conducted on Pruter.
Right. I'm sure you must be buried under feature requests for such, incorporating proctoring right into Pruter. The new normal and so on. But yeah, that question was from Bhumika Shah earlier, and I think there was a follow-up question from Prajesh Prasad, who is asking if you're planning to conduct interviews with students to examine how they use the tool and whether they found the feedback from the tool useful.
So, I mean, we did some studies earlier. Now it's being used for 6 to 7 years, okay, at IIT Kanpur. And I would say that at this point, it's we are not, it's impossible to think about conducting our introductory programming course without Pruter.
Right,
Okay.
right. It's gotten to that point, of course. But okay, so I think just related to that, do you record like a heat map of the interaction? So this is also a question from Rajesh in the chat. Do you record interaction and click data, which shows how the students interacted with the feedback?
Okay, so we looked at how many times they click plus button for example-based generation, how many of them looked at first top prediction versus second prediction versus third prediction, but we have not done advanced level of analytics like eye gazing or mouse movement and other things. So those are all probably could be done in the future. We still do not have that capability. At least I am not into that domain, so a little bit difficult for me. So I will need some collaboration on that front.
Yeah, okay, that's a hint there for the attendees in the chat, please, I'm assuming. Yeah, so Jayashree Prasad has a question about whether you make a, so when you make a repo of errors, how do you categorize them? Is it ongoing? What are your sources for collecting errors other than from your own students?
Okay, so sources, currently it is only our data. See, once again, there are these ethical issues about using other people's data. Though I have some data with the permission from people who use Pruter at their institutes, we are still not using that data for any of our research as of now. People at IISc have used it, not just Viraj, but other professors have used it. People at NSU have used it, but they use it on their own. Okay, so.
Right.
About the categorization, right now, again, the categorization is automatic. As I said, it's just numbers. Okay, we are just categorizing, so bucketizing the errors. I was just trying to look at a small slide. Maybe I will just share it if it is possible. Is it visible, a slide?
Yeah, yeah,
an image?
it is. Yeah.
This is some plan that I have in future. One is about the categorizing errors. Another is about creating a repository which can work as a search engine for programming problems. You type what features you want and you can get a nice programming problem there for use, which again kind of connects with Venkatesh's creation of collaboration on creating problems. We need to give natural language feedback. As of now, all our feedback is about these programs and then other kind of things. For categorization also, I am currently there's an MTech work which is going on. Hopefully in a year or so that will be out. Okay.
Okay, yeah, that's great to know. I mean, yeah, I think that's probably addressed all the questions in the chat so far. And I was also like, just a quick question about whether you have some sort of peer grading built into Pruter, or whether you've ever been asked for that sort of a feature. Peer grading for things like programming style and other fuzzy things that are even harder for these automated systems to catch, like good variable naming conventions, good documentation via comments, things like that.
Right. So currently in the deployed instance of Pruter, we do manual grading. So TAs are responsible for looking at programming styles and all. We do not have a peer grading where students can look at each other's code and grade it. Okay, but we did an interesting experiment again in first few instances or offerings of ESC 101. We assigned each exam problem for grading to two, or each submission to 2 TAs, and then looked at if there was any discrepancy. And we could see some TAs who are doing working very fast, not giving proper grades and so on. But unfortunately, that did not translate into, I lost that work in a way. So it could not translate into some kind of research or anything. But yes, it was useful, and maybe someday I again would like to bring that work back.
Right, absolutely. No, that's very interesting. So yeah, great to know. And as I said, this has been, I think we were all absolutely hooked. It's really nice to get this sort of behind the scenes sneak peek into your tools and mechanisms that are driving so many of these programming courses across the country, and hopefully perhaps even beyond. So thanks very much again. I'm definitely signing up and contacting you offline to figure out how we can.
Yes, I am looking for collaboration because, as I said, I only focus on programming language aspects. But when you are teaching students, teaching involves so many other domains. I mean, we saw ethics, and then there are these learning aspects as well, how people learn to program and so on. So and then the third thing is about this user interactions and user studies. So yeah, I will be interested if anyone can have any idea about how we can go ahead, and would be interested in collaborating.
Absolutely, so much potential here and so many aspects. So yeah, a lot of thank yous in the chat. Clearly, a huge virtual applause to you. Thank you very much again for this really engaging and wonderful talk. Thank you. So I think with that, we wrap up the first part of the computing education research session. I think the second part is on the other side of the lunch break, and I don't want to be standing any further between you and potentially a good lunch, hopefully. So we will, I think, resume at 2:30 p.m. and back to the organizers. Thank you so much to the speakers once again, and for the audience for being so wonderful and interactive. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Neeldhara, and thanks to Amay and R. Venkatesh. So we're breaking for lunch and we'll meet again at 2:30 p.m.
Yep, sounds great. Thank you again, and see you back at 2:30 then. Bye.